The card wipe and card dance effects are both similar in their controls, but they're in two different categories. So card wipe is under the transition category and card dance is under the simulation category. It takes a bit to wrap your head around both of these, but card wipe is simpler than card dance, so we're gonna start there. So I'm gonna go into the transition category, find card wipe, and just apply it to my first picture. Now I don't actually need to see both of my pictures here. I have the front of cards and the back of cards. What I'm gonna do is just shut off the back cards and shut off my background layer, and you can see through to the transparent pixels now. Now the reason why I don't need to see that second layer is because I can choose it as the back layer of the card wipe effect. So I'm going to choose that as the back layer, so pick 2. And now when I increase the transition completion, you can see that these cards from the effect, not in the photos, are flipping around and we're seeing the second photo on the back side of those cards. So it's a 3D effect that just transitions by flipping all of these individual tiles from front to back. And all of the other controls just change how this actual transition looks. So let's take a look at the transition width control. That's what's next. If I decrease this, it's going to just make this fall off between where the cards are flipping and where the other cards are starting to flip smaller. Or if I widen that out, then it's going to be a lot smoother. Pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to set that back to 50%. We've already taken a look at the back layer. This is just where you choose what you want the back layer to be. You can also choose none if you just want to use this as a wipe off to reveal whatever's underneath it without flipping. I'll put that back to pick 2. And then we have rows and columns. And this is where we determine if it's going to be independent or if the columns follow the rows. So if they're independent, that gives us 2 separate controls right here. One for rows, one for columns. If I change this to columns follow rows, then they'll both be whatever you set the rows number to. So if I set this up to 20, there will be both 20 rows and columns. But if I change that back to independent, then I could say put 3 columns and 2 rows. And now if I play this back, you can see those 3 columns and a lot more rows. You can change this to whatever number you want. If you turn it all the way down to 1 row, then you're pretty much just gonna get this kind of twisty, almost DNA looking helix shape. Or if I go the other way around and just turn up the rows and turn columns all the way down to 1, then we're gonna get kind of like a Venetian blinds effect, except each one of those blinds is going to flip. Now currently they're all flipping at the same time, and transition width isn't going to do anything because it's the height that I'm concerned with. But if we take a look at the next control, flip direction, we have positive, negative, or random. So I could change this to negative, and then they're gonna flip the other direction. And I don't mean vertically, but they're rotating in the opposite direction, or you could change it to random, and then it's going to be a different direction for each row. Let me change that back to positive, and then the next option is flip order. This is set to left to right currently, which is why they're all rotating at the exact same time, because there's only 1 column. But if I change this to top to bottom, now they're going to rotate from the top to the bottom. Again, I could change this from positive to negative, and then it will flip the opposite direction or random. It's all relative to what you have set up here. Let me change this back to positive and then change the flip axis from X to Y and show you that now this is going to rotate around the Y axis rather than the X axis. And because I have it set top to bottom, it's gonna make that same helix shape, but vertically. And I can again increase the columns so we can have lots of these shapes, make this a lot more detailed. There's a lot of customization here. Now we did jump over this card scale option, and if I turn that down, you can see that that's just scaling down the tiles. And if I zoom in right nice and close here on the 10 of spades, you can see that this is actually scaling down the image. It's breaking up the image into all of these individual tiles and controlling them independently. It's not just cropping it like the grid effect. All right, I'm gonna change that back to 1 and zoom out. And then let's take a look at some other options. Next up is the gradient layer, and this is actually dependent on the flip order. So if I go back into this menu, we see lots of different directions that we can go, but the last option is gradient. If I choose that, then I need to set my gradient layer. So I'm gonna make a new layer, going up to layer, new solid, and just click OK. And I should label this for Ben Marriott. So we'll call this gradient map. And I'm going to add a ramp effect, and then just hide the layer. Again, I don't need to see it, I just need it to be in my comp. And then I'll choose the gradient layer as the gradient map and make sure to choose effects and masks underneath that source. What this does is determines the direction of the flipping. And so currently it's just going to flip vertically from top to bottom. But if I grab my gradient and I change this, I'll just grab the control points and maybe angle it like this, bring the black all the way over here, bring the white all the way over here, turn it off. Now my transition is going to happen from that left to right. So the darkest pixels on the top left are where the transition will start, and the brightest pixels are where they will end. So I could do something really crazy. It doesn't have to be a gradient. If I go into my gradient map and just add a checkerboard effect, let's add that on top and set the blending mode to normal and make them black, and then turn off that gradient map. And then I'll just increase the size really, really big. All right, so now everything is pure black or pure white. I'll shut this off, and now the flipping direction is going to happen in that checkerboard pattern, with the black tiles first and then the white tiles. And if I added a little bit of feathering to my checkerboard, if I go into the feather and I change this to like 20 by 20, actually that's probably not enough. Let's say 100 by 100, turn that back off. What's going to happen is it's going to soften out that checkerboard pattern a little bit. And I could probably make that even softer. Let's go 500 by 500 and see that a little bit more dramatic of a change, okay? So that's how gradient map works. Whatever you put into this will determine the flipping order of the tiles as long as you have the flip order set to gradient. I'm going to change that back to left to right just for now. And then let's take a look at the timing randomness. So I'll put this back into the center of the frame and actually change this from top left to bottom right just so we can see some more detail. And just turn up the timing randomness. This is simply going to randomize the timing of each flip so it's not so uniform, and you can increase or decrease that as much as you want. There's also a random seed for that randomness, so if you don't like a certain frame, you could start on a different random seed. All right, now we're getting to the 3D section of this effect, and that is one really cool thing about this effect, is it does support 3D. So first, let's take a look at our camera system options. We have camera position, corner pins, and comp camera. Camera position is the effects camera. So it isn't looking for a camera in my comp. It's basically the effects camera. So I can rotate this around however I want to see that it is truly 3D, and I can also move it around in 3D space. I even have the ability to change the focal length of the camera. So I could make it a wider lens and then move in closer, and it will look like I have a wider angle lens. And we also have the ability to change the transform order to all of these different options if you need to, but that is a little bit more complicated than it needs to be because you can use a comp camera. So I'm going to switch to that for now and then add a comp camera. Go up to Layer, New, Camera, and I'll make this a, let's say, 35mm camera and click OK. And immediately we can see everything again, but if I switch to my camera tools, so this is the dolly tool, I'll just click and drag out, press C to get to my orbit tool, and then just rotate around. So this will interact with anything that is 3D in your scene. It will not interact in the sense that it will render with their objects. It's going to render on top or below whatever layers it's on top or below of, but it respects the 3D camera and 3D space in After Effects. All right, let's go back into the effects and take a look at corner pins. And this simply gives you 4 corner pins that you can click and drag to place anywhere you want. But as you can see, when I put this down at a lower angle, the 3D-ness of these tiles are still preserved. So if you ever needed to stick this on a computer screen or a billboard or something, but you still wanted to maintain that 3D look, this is a really easy way to do that. And you could even tie these corner pins to tracked data. So if you used a camera tracker, you could grab that position data and tie it to these points so it looked like it was comped into your shot. We also have this auto focal length checkbox, which if I check it, it will basically take the corner pins information and attempt to just generate a correct focal length to keep all of the perspective accurate. But we could also uncheck that and use a custom focal length to make that depth more or less extreme. All right, I'm going to change that back to comp camera and take a look at the lighting controls. The first property is light type, and it's set to distance source, meaning the effect is generating a light, and you can increase or decrease the intensity of that light. You could change the color of that light, and you can even move that light position around, and you can see how that's affecting all of the tiles in the scene. We can also change the light depth, meaning how far this light is basically traveling before it starts to fall off. And we can increase or decrease the ambient light to fill in some of those shadows. Now you can think of distance source as basically like the sun or something that's really far away. And if I change this to point source, think of this more like a light bulb that's much closer to the overall scene. So if I turn the ambient light down and turn the light depth down, maybe not quite so far, but right about there, then you can see that this looks a lot more like a light bulb that's just moving around the scene. All right, and then finally we have first comp light. So this effect works with one comp light, but not an unlimited amount. So if I go up to layer, new, light, and I'll make this a point light, everything else is good, I'll click OK. This is gonna work basically the same way as the point source in the effect, where it's just a light bulb basically that travels around the scene. The benefit of doing it with a comp light is that it will interact with other layers that use 3D lights. All right, let's take a look at the next section, which is material. And here we just have three options. We have the diffuse reflection, so that increases or decreases the diffuse. We have specular reflection, which will basically just make these cards look a little bit more shiny, especially if you turn it all the way down, you can see that. And then we have the highlight sharpness, which will control the fall off of that specular highlight. But those are the three lighting controls we have. Collapse that up and look at position jitter next. And this is where we can add in some randomness that's actually animated on the position properties. So we can change the X jitter amount, the X jitter speed, and so on for Y and Z. You can think of this like the wiggle expression. It's just adding some random movement and you can control how quickly it's actually moving. And we could do this on all three axes. And if I collapse that up and go into the rotation, we have the exact same controls except for rotation instead of position. Okay, so those are all of the controls for the card wipe effect. Now I'm going to shut off card wipe and we're going to add the card dance effect. So I'll search for that card dance underneath simulation and apply that again to my first layer. And I'm quickly going to get rid of my light and camera and take a look at how card dance is a little different. Now the main difference between card wipe and card dance is that card wipe is strictly a transition. Card dance can be used to manipulate your image in almost a limitless number of ways. But many of the controls from card wipe carry over into card dance. The first three, for example, we have rows and columns. Independent or columns follows rows. That works exactly the same way. But we're not seeing any kind of transition and there's no transition slider. And that's because we have to set it up a little bit. First of all, the back layer is set to the layer it's applied to, but I'm going to change that to this layer, the second card layer. And then we have gradient layer 1, gradient layer 2, rotation order, transform order, which don't make a lot of sense if you don't know what's happening with this effect. I'm going to skip over those for now and move down to just say X rotation. Right here we have source and it's set to none for the moment. I'm going to leave it like that for now and just go to the offset value. You see the multiplier is set to 90. If I change offset, it's going to rotate all of the rows on the X axis by whatever number I put in here. So if I say 90 degrees, then they'll all be rotated straight at the camera. And if I go into the Y rotation and do the same thing for it, then those tiles are going to rotate. Let me offset the X rotation back a little bit and show you how that's working. Okay, everything is moving at the exact same time if all I do is offset these values. Okay, so each one of these offset properties will allow me to rotate or shift the position or even the scale of my layers. If I turn the scale offset down on the X and the scale offset down on the Y, then we're just scaling all of those pieces down. But that's not all that interesting or useful. So how can we make some use of this? Well, that's where we're going to backtrack up to this gradient layer 1. So I'm going to just choose this same gradient map that we used before, which remember looked like this. And actually, let's turn off the checkerboard and just start with a simple linear gradient to start. Okay, turn that off, go back and make sure to choose effects and masks, and then go into, let's say, the Y rotation and take a look at the source that we want to drive that Y rotation. Currently it's set to none, but if I change it to intensity 1, then it's gonna pull the intensity from our first gradient layer. So all of these options right here have 1 at the end, and that means that they're all corresponding to gradient layer 1. Oh, and I just caught a mistake. I changed the back layers to effects and masks. That's not what I wanted. I want to change this gradient layer 1 to effects and masks, and there we go. Now we're pulling the intensity from that gradient layer, this one right here. And if I again change that to none, nothing is happening, change it to intensity 1, and we're getting this rotation on the Y rotation multiplied by the intensity values of that gradient layer to whatever value we have set here. So if I turn this down to 0, we're going to get no rotation, and if I increase it up again to 90, The darker pixels are rotating one direction, the brightest pixels are rotating another direction, and everything in between is rotating a factor of that multiplier. And again, I can offset this so we could have this kind of spinning, like wind chime looking motion on all of these tiles. But if I go into that gradient map and just change the direction of this gradient, you can see how quickly and easily I'm able to just completely shape the way that this looks. And if I change the gradient to, say, a radial gradient, then we're going to have a spot that's in the middle of the layer shaping this effect. So if I increase the rows and the columns to be a lot higher, then we can get something much smoother. And using that multiplier, we can kind of increase the intensity and combine that with rotating the offset to get something that looks very unique. And I can go in a negative direction as well. You can do whatever you want with these properties. But this is the foundation of how the entire effect works. You choose a gradient layer as your source for a certain property or a certain transformation, and then set the multiplier and animate the offset. And you can animate the multiplier as well. Now, looking at the source, there are two sets of all of these options, 1 and 2, and that's because we have two gradient layers. So if I duplicate my gradient map and I turn the checkerboard on this one, so it looks like this, I could use that layer to drive, say, the scale of the tiles. So I'll go to gradient map 2, make sure that's effects and masks, and go down to the X scale, change that to intensity 2, and the Y scale as well, intensity 2. And now we're getting two layers of these gradients working with each other. And I could offset them or change the multiplier however I want. The reason this is so powerful is because you can combine this in so many different ways. You could use animated gradients, you could use gradients layered on top of each other, and they don't even have to be black and white. I could set my gradient layer to be this picture, and I'll turn off my gradient layer too. And now everything is being based on the lightness or the intensity of the actual photo of these cards. So you could even use footage if you wanted to drive this effect. And as you can see, we can do this on the position, rotation, and scale of all of the tiles. And everything else are things that we've already seen, like the camera system, camera position, corner pins, the lighting controls, and the material controls. All of these things carry over from card wipe. Now I realize that this effect is so open-ended that you might have a hard time knowing how in the world am I going to use it. So I'm going to quickly show you one example. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because my friend Caleb Ward has put together a tutorial on how to do this exact effect. So check out the card above for that. But what I'm going to do is pull in a different photo that's kind of this moody black and white portrait. And what I'll do is turn this into kind of a hologram looking effect. So let me add the card dance effect to it. And I'm going to use it as the gradient layer. Since it's black and white and moody already, this should work pretty well. So I'm going to choose the gradient layer to be this particular photo. Okay, so what I want to do is use that gradient layer, the intensity of this photo, and affect the Z position. So I'm going to go into the Z position, change the source to intensity 1, and all of my tiles have shifted a little bit. Now I want to crank these tiles up. I want to have them be really tiny squares, basically. So I'm going to not be afraid of chugging my machine a little bit and just turn these way up so that this is now basically made up of a bunch of little squares. I'm going to increase this even a little bit more. So we're getting this kind of digital pixelated looking effect now, but it's going to be a little bit easier to see if I rotate the camera a little bit. So I'm going to change the camera system to comp camera, and I'm going to add a new camera, layer new camera, 35 millimeter, and then just rotate it using my orbit tool. So as I do this, things get a little freaky. But what's happening is it's offsetting each one of these individual tiny little tiles in the Z-axis based on the intensity of each pixel of the photo. Now I can decrease the intensity of this if I go into that intensity multiplier and just change it down to say 0.25. And now it's not going to be offset quite as much, but we're still getting a little bit of depth. Now, this is not going to work with just any photo. This one in particular works fairly well because it's lit from basically right in front of her head. And so we're getting the closest parts of her facial features brighter than the features that are further back. Now, the sunglasses are very dark, so those tiles are going to be pushed further back into her head, which is why it looks so disturbing and kind of like a skull when we rotate the camera. But it is giving that little bit of depth to make this look a little bit more like a 3D hologram. So let me turn this up to maybe 0.5, zoom in here, and then maybe I'll go to the X and Y scale and I'll just offset them by maybe 0.5 to make them all just a little bit smaller. So now we see some separation between each of these squares. 0.75 might be a little bit better to fill in some of those gaps. Okay, so now those squares are a little bit more defined. And if I took my camera orbit and I just rotated the camera a little bit, that'll give just the slightest bit of parallax that'll make this a really believable looking hologram. And we could take this even a little bit further. If I first just shut off Card Dance for a second and add a Venetian blinds effect, one of my favorite effects, before Card Dance, and increase the transition completion to 50%, change the direction to 90 degrees, and then maybe decrease the width a little bit, and turn Card Dance back on, now we're gonna get these layered scan lines on top of it, and maybe the width needs to be a little bit smaller, so it's not quite taking away so much. And I could even turn the transition completion maybe down to 40 to fill in some of those gaps. But those Venetian blinds are now kind of wrapping around the contours of this photo, rather than if I were to apply it after Card Dance, just going straight across. So that helps sell the effect a lot more. Now let's add a little bit of color. I'm going to add a tritone effect, which allows me to tint the highlights, shadows, and midtones independently. So I'm just going to take the midtones, make it like a greenish blue color, somewhere around here, and then add a new solid behind this photo, and we'll call this ramp. Move it below this photo and fill it with a ramp. So I'll type in ramp. Change it to be a radial ramp, and then change the colors to be maybe a brighter blue, maybe not quite so bright, and a very dark saturated greenish blue. And that bright blue is definitely too bright. So I'm going to bring it down, maybe make it a little bit more deep royal blue, and then just offset these so that it looks like we have a light source up at the top. And I'm going to change the blend mode of this photo to add. And that way it will blend out all of the black and blend into that light source a lot more of that ramp that we just created. And I'll make that just a little bit more green so it matches the colors overall. And if I wanted to, I could just finish this all off with a nice subtle glow effect on top of that Card Dance. So I'll apply that, make it a little bit more soft, maybe mess with the glow threshold a little bit and the intensity a little bit down. But there we go. In relatively few simple steps, we've created a pretty convincing looking hologram, which we can tweak endlessly and use other parts of Card Dance to even reveal it. So if I wanted just to quickly reveal this in a, let's say, this radial gradient way, I'll change the gradient layer 2 to be that gradient map, making sure effects and masks is selected, and then go to the Y position and we'll set the source to intensity 2, turn the multiplier way up so that this basically goes off screen, and also change the offset down. Set keyframes for both of those, go forward maybe a second, and then reset these back to where they were. And in fact, I'm going to set the multiplier down to 0 so it ends up not affecting it at all. I'll easy ease into those last two keyframes and then just crank this out a little bit and then preview. And there you have it. We have a transition into this hologram look. Now, like I said, the possibilities for this effect is pretty limitless. So get in there, experiment with it, see what you can come up with, and do some searching online to see how other people have used it. But that is my very fast-paced overview of Card Wipe and Card Dance. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this tutorial, then check out the other ones here on my YouTube channel. And if you like my teaching style, then definitely check out my longer form content on Skillshare and School of Motion. And if you want to support more tutorials like this one, check out my Patreon. You can find links for all of that stuff in the description of this video.